The earth does not forget. Beneath the shallow surface of a quiet hillside in Central Europe, archaeologists uncovered a burial that changed how we think about the prehistoric world. The remains were old, over 7,000 years, but it wasn't their age that unsettled the excavation team. It was their arrangement. Several skeletons were found face down in the soil. One had limbs tightly bound. Another showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Some were buried apart from others, isolated, without grave goods, without ceremony. Their graves were shallow, hastily dug, almost as though the living couldn't bear to get too close. These were not honored dead. They were hidden. There were no stone tools beside them, no beads or shells, no offerings of ochre. There were no protective coverings, no signs of ritual care. The bodies seemed placed with caution or fear. Carbon dating placed them in the late Neolithic period. The region, now farmland, was once a patchwork of forests and early settlements. The people who lived here farmed, hunted, and buried their dead in patterned rows, usually with care. But these burials did not follow the pattern. Their bodies told stories their voices never could. A broken arm, never healed, a dislocated jaw, a pelvis crushed from one side. The signs were not of accident, but of intention. What stands out is not just the violence, but the silence that followed it. No monumental markers, no community mourning, no evidence of remembrance. These individuals were not only killed, they were erased. What had they done? Or more precisely, what were they believed to be? There is no inscription, no written accusation, no carved tablet bearing guilt or innocence. There is only a body, a pit, and the choices made by those who put them there. And in graves like these, scattered across prehistoric Europe and beyond, we begin to see a pattern. One that suggests that long before organized religion, before legal systems, before the word witch had even been spoken, humans already feared what they could not understand. They buried that fear. They buried it face down. But before we go any further, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Only if you enjoy what I do here, uncovering the dark side of history they never taught us in school. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to connect with you, my friends from all over the world, joining me on this journey through the past. Because this story doesn't begin with magic or spells, it begins with silence, with shame, with bones that refused to stay hidden. What they did to those feared and forgotten before history was ever written is the story we must now confront.
Before we can understand how some were buried in shame, we must understand how all lived in a world that was raw, exposed, and deeply vulnerable. Tens of thousands of years ago, much of the earth was still locked in the grip of the last ice age. Vast sheets of ice covered much of northern Europe. The air was dry, harsh, and unpredictable. Winters were long and violent. Summers were short and barely enough to allow for recovery. To the east, in parts of what is now the Levant, the land gave way to semi-arid plateaus where rain came rarely and failed often. Elsewhere, dense forests and marshlands made movement difficult, and the threat of wild predators was constant. Humans were scattered across this landscape in small, mobile groups, no larger than 30 to 50 individuals at a time. Some remained nomadic, moving with herds or seasons. Others began to settle briefly, creating early villages near rivers, where the land was fertile enough to support new forms of life. Grains, beans, barley, and the first attempts at domesticated animals. But most of life was still shaped by scarcity. Shelter was never guaranteed. In colder regions, people carved homes into the earth, pit houses insulated with mud and bone, hidden from the wind. Others made use of caves, natural alcoves that provided protection from weather and attack. In milder regions, tents of stretched animal hide were erected, anchored with sharpened stakes and stone rings. The daily diet was inconsistent and often desperate. The hunt was central. People tracked deer, wild boar, aurochs, and even mammoths. They followed migrations on foot, sometimes for weeks. But meat was a luxury. Most of the time, survival meant gathering roots, nuts, berries, seeds. Every piece of food was hard-earned, and every meal could be the last before a failed hunt or bad season brought hunger again. They used what they could find. Tools were made from stone, bone, and antler. Flint scrapers for skinning, stone blades for butchering, bone needles for sewing hides. These tools weren't crude. They were crafted with care and skill passed down through generations. Their makers understood the angles of fracture, the tension of sinew, the edge of stone sharp enough to slice skin. Clothing reflected necessity. Animal skins were scraped clean, dried, and stitched into cloaks or leggings. Primitive sandals were tied with plant fiber. In colder climates, layers were vital. Fur-lined hoods and hide wraps, kept close to the body with bone pins or knots. There were no dyes, no decoration, just function. They spoke, though no language remains. There are no inscriptions, but there is symbolism. On the walls of caves, handprints spread in ochre and soot. Animals with too many legs. Spirals. Eyes. Signs that meant something. Perhaps sacred, perhaps warning, perhaps belonging to a system of belief we can no longer decode. The human body paid a price for this world. Skeletons from the time show short stature and heavy wear. Spinal compression from years of carrying loads. Broken ribs that healed crooked. Teeth worn to the root from eating grit-filled grain. Life expectancy was low. Many died before 30. Women often died younger, from childbirth, from complications, from injury. Infants perished often, sometimes within days. Even minor wounds could turn fatal. There were no doctors. No midwives in any formal sense. No medicine beyond what could be chewed, boiled, or guessed. Bones show signs of infections left untreated. Tuberculosis in the spine. Periostitis on limbs, evidence of long-standing inflammation. In some graves, the remains of children show stunted growth, curved limbs, and starvation lines on teeth, clear evidence of repeated nutritional stress. And still, they endured. Because humans are adaptable, resourceful, capable of beauty in the midst of hardship. They buried their dead in deliberate ways. They decorated tools. They made art. They taught their children. They remembered things, and passed them down without writing. But that same instinct to protect, to preserve the group, could also turn inward. When resources ran out, when illness spread, when death came too often or too soon, people looked for causes, for explanations. And sometimes, they found them not in nature, but in each other. That is the world they lived in. Not a world of evil, but a world of desperation. A world where survival left no space for uncertainty. Where the strange, the sick, the unlucky, could become a threat. And where some were cast out, not in life, but in death. There is a silence in the archaeological record that speaks louder than words. The silence of people who did not choose how they died. In the prehistoric world, survival was not guaranteed. It was negotiated, often brutally, between bodies and environment. There were no reserves, no markets, no aid. When crops failed, when animals vanished, when the cold stretched too long or the rain came too late, the human body became both victim and resource. In the caves of northern Spain, specifically at El Sidrón, archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 12 Neanderthals. The bones were broken, systematically dismantled. Long bones were split lengthwise to access the fatty marrow within. Skulls were fractured at their base to extract brain tissue. There were cut marks on the ribs, the fingers, the jaw, locations that suggest intentional butchering. There were no signs of animal scavenging. The damage was human. The victims were young and old, male and female, likely a family group. There was no sign of a raid. No weapons embedded. No evidence of outside attackers. Everything points to the unthinkable, that this was done by those who knew them. This is survival cannibalism, the final resort. Not symbolic, not ritualized, just hunger, sharpened by desperation. Gough's Cave in England tells a similar story, though with more complexity. Human bones here also show cut marks and marrow extraction. But some skulls appear to have been deliberately reshaped, turned into shallow bowls. One piece even carries what may be incised decoration. Was this purely survival? Or was there meaning in it? Was the body seen not only as food, but as a vessel for something sacred, feared, or remembered? Archaeologists distinguish two broad forms of cannibalism: survival and ritual. Survival cannibalism emerges under extreme pressure, famine, isolation, failure. It leaves a signature of clean butchery, of quick processing, of no ceremonial context. Ritual cannibalism is different. It occurs in contexts where food is not lacking, but where the body carries meaning. Flesh might be eaten to preserve the spirit. Bones might be buried with care. Sometimes it's the act, not the nourishment, that matters. The prehistoric record gives us both. And often the lines blur. In many early burial sites, especially from the late Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, there are disproportionate numbers of children and elderly individuals. In some cases, their bones are found in mass pits, jumbled, broken, and burned. The most vulnerable were clearly the most disposable. But were they sacrificed? Or simply left behind? The truth may lie somewhere in between. In times of environmental collapse, drought, volcanic activity, disease, groups had to make decisions. Who could walk? Who could work? Who consumed more than they gave? Among the remains found at the Herxheim site in Germany, more than 500 individuals were uncovered, many disarticulated, many with signs of defleshing and breakage. The site dates to around 5000 BC. The bones were brought from outside, transported, deposited, and processed. Some skulls were placed together, almost as offerings. Others were cracked open. Children were among them. There is debate about what happened here. Was it ritual? Mass sacrifice? Cannibalism? A funerary rite involving the consumption or symbolic destruction of the dead? Some scholars argue the dead were enemies, killed and dishonored. Others suggest famine, where even the dead were too valuable to leave whole. There are no definitive answers, only patterns. High numbers of infant burials appear across many Neolithic cemeteries, far beyond what would be expected from natural mortality. In some cases, infants are buried in separate locations, apart from adults. In others, multiple infants are buried in a single shallow grave, hastily and without offerings. One explanation is disease, plagues that took the young before others. Another is seasonal collapse, harvests failing just as infants were born. But some archaeologists raise the possibility of infanticide. When communities are under severe pressure, the youngest, especially those born premature, sickly, or female, may be the first to die. In environments where every additional mouse strains the group, hard decisions are made in silence. Similar logic may have applied to the elderly. At sites like Lipensky Vir in the Balkans, older individuals are sometimes buried with less care, no grave goods, no ochre, no adornment. Their bodies show signs of wear, arthritis, collapsed vertebrae, broken hips. People who could no longer contribute. Some were buried far from central clusters, in positions suggesting haste. A few may not have been buried at all. Abandonment was not announced. It simply happened. And then there is sacrifice, not as an act of worship, but of loss calculation. In Anatolia, at the site of Catalhuk, archaeologists have found burials beneath house floors. Most are ordinary, flexed skeletons, small offerings. But a few stand out, young individuals, usually women, buried beneath thresholds or doorways, with strange positioning, face down, limbs crossed, skulls missing. Were they offerings? Or were they people whose deaths were interpreted as meaningful? The archaeological record cannot say whether these were volunteers, victims, or accused. But their placement, at liminal spaces between inside and outside, life and death, suggests a symbolic role. These acts were not theatrical. They were quiet, deliberate, and, by our standards, cold. Yet for the people who lived in these times, they may have been acts of balance, of restoring harmony when nature had turned against them. Still, alternative explanations must be acknowledged. Post-mortem scavenging by animals can resemble butchery. Bone breakage could occur through natural collapse. Child burials might reflect disease outbreaks or cultural age segregation. But when pattern follows pattern, across caves, rivers, and valleys, it becomes harder to explain away. The prehistoric world did not invent cruelty. It responded to pressure. And in that pressure, in that desperation, lines were crossed. Not out of sadism, but out of necessity. In that context, anyone who could not be explained, or who was seen as unlucky, cursed, or spiritually dangerous, became a liability. And those labeled as different, by appearance, by behavior, by birth, faced a simple and brutal fate: removal, buried apart, bound, cut, hidden, not because of what they were, but because of what others believed they might bring. Violence did not begin with civilization. It came before the walls, before the kings, before the scrolls and swords. It was already present when the world was young and scattered, when people lived in small bands, slept close to the earth, and survived by instinct. In this early world, violence was not yet institutional, but it was already organized. It did not need borders to define enemies. It needed only fear. The Talheim death pit, discovered in southern Germany, offers one of the clearest windows into this early brutality. Dating to around 5000 BC, the site held the remains of 34 individuals. Men, women, and children, stacked haphazardly in a shallow pit. No pattern, no spacing, just bodies piled one over the next. The trauma was specific. Many skulls bore crushing injuries, delivered from behind or above. Several individuals had multiple wounds. Some had arms raised, bones fractured mid-defense. Others had clean, singular strikes to the head, suggesting they were restrained or unaware when struck. This was not combat. This was execution. The people buried at Talheim were not buried with tools, clothing, or tokens. They were stripped of everything but the trauma they carried. No care was given in death. Their placement spoke not of sorrow, but of disposal. Far from isolated, Talheim fits a broader pattern of collective violence appearing across early human settlements. At Naderik in what is now western Kenya, dating back roughly 10,000 years, archaeologists found the remains of at least 27 individuals, men, women, and children, scattered on what would once have been a fertile lakeshore. Some still had obsidian blade fragments embedded in their bones. One woman was found in a seated position, her hands likely bound behind her back. Her skull was crushed. She was pregnant. The position of her body, combined with fetal remains in the abdominal region, confirmed she died with the child still within her. She was not alone. Other women showed signs of execution-like violence. Children were among the dead. No grave was dug. These bodies were not returned to the earth. They were left where they fell. The weapons used in both Talheim and Naderik were primitive, but effective. Clubs made of heavy wood or bone. Flint axes with sharpened edges. Spear points chipped from obsidian or stone. They left behind clear forensic evidence. linear fractures, pierced ribs, shattered skulls. Each injury tells a story of contact, of force, of intent. And that intent appears to have been deliberate. In both cases, the targeting of women, and specifically pregnant women, is deeply significant. These were not casualties of random battle. They were acts of domination. To kill a pregnant woman is not only to destroy life, but the potential for future life. It is to erase a lineage, a bloodline, a threat before it can begin. These acts may have been tactical. Control over land, water, or migration routes could spark cycles of retaliatory raids. The motive may have been scarcity, eliminate the rival group before they consume limited resources. Or it may have been social, assert dominance, erase memory, send a message. But violence was not always between equals. Sometimes it was internal, targeting members of a group who were seen as dangerous not for their actions, but for what they represented. In some burial sites, especially those on the outskirts of early farming villages, archaeologists have found solitary female skeletons buried in unnatural positions. Some were interred face down, with limbs bent sharply or pinned under heavy stones. Others were missing skulls, or had been placed far from any known habitation site. These burials do not fit the community pattern. They were not marked. They were not visited. They were erased. The reasons are not recorded, but the implications are disturbing. In small, tight-knit communities, conformity was often survival. Outsiders, whether by birth, behavior, disability, or belief, may have been seen as threats. Widows without protectors, women who bore no children, those who spoke differently, walked strangely, or carried too much misfortune. There may have been no word for which in these early languages. But the concept, the fear of someone carrying unseen danger, was already taking form. Some were blamed when children died or when harvests failed. Some may have been isolated during epidemics. Some may simply have lived too long after their peers, their presence raising discomfort among the young. And in a world where fear and survival shape morality, these differences became dangerous. These people, mostly women, may not have been feared for powers. They were feared for difference. Difference, in such a precarious world, could mean unpredictability. Unpredictability meant risk. And risk had to be managed. So they were removed. Sometimes violently. Sometimes silently. Sometimes by the community that once sheltered them. These patterns, of killing, of exclusion, of disposal, did not need writing to survive. They were encoded into practice, into instinct, into the shape of graves and the direction of bones. They show us that violence was never just about conflict. It was about control, about defining who belonged and who did not. And long before the idea of witches was spoken aloud, their bones were already being buried. Face down, bound, alone. Burial is never just about the body. It is about what the living believe the dead can still do. In the prehistoric world, death was not an end. It was a threshold, a passage, perhaps, but not always a peaceful one. And how a body was treated after death often said more about fear than it did about love. The majority of early human burials followed clear and repeated customs. Bodies were placed in fetal positions, oriented in specific directions, sometimes covered in red ochre, a symbol that may have represented life, blood, or rebirth. Grave goods were often included: stone tools, beads, shells, animal bones. These were not acts of disposal. They were acts of remembrance, of reverence. But then there are the exceptions. Across Neolithic Europe, the Near East, and even parts of Central Asia, archaeologists have uncovered burials that break the pattern. Graves where the body is not curled peacefully, but laid face down. Arms wrenched behind the back. Legs bent unnaturally. Some bodies were staked to the ground, literally pinned in place using sharpened wooden poles or heavy stones. Others had large stones placed on their chests, ribs, or faces, pressing them down as though to contain something. In several cases, the head is missing entirely. At the site of Offnet in southern Germany, 2 Neolithic pits were found filled with skulls, dozens of them. The skulls had been carefully arranged, some facing inward, some stacked. The bodies themselves were gone. The separation was intentional. The site suggests that heads were removed after death and used in a secondary ritual, possibly to venerate ancestors, or to mark out enemies. Elsewhere, skulls appear in domestic settings, buried under house floors, or kept on display in shallow pits. In some settlements, a tradition emerged of burying only the skull, with the rest of the body discarded or unrecorded. This points to an early belief that the head, seat of identity and vision, held special power. It could be revered or feared. One particularly unsettling example comes from the Levantine site of Tel Aswad, where plastered skulls were uncovered. Human crania were taken after death, the flesh removed, and the faces reconstructed with lime plaster. Cowrie shells were placed in the eye sockets. These were not artistic expressions. They were ritual objects. To keep, to display, or perhaps to control. In other burials, bodies were found with stones inside their mouths. This detail appears not only in prehistoric contexts, but continues into recorded history. In Iron Age Europe and even into the early Christian era, individuals suspected of sorcery or vampirism were sometimes buried with stones or bricks jammed between their jaws. The reasoning was clear, even if unspoken, to prevent the dead from speaking, biting, or returning. Could these prehistoric examples suggest a similar fear? Possibly. But we must be cautious. A stone in the mouth could also have symbolic or practical reasons, perhaps an offering, a marker, or a local burial rite. The context and pattern matter. Other graves show what researchers call double burials. In these, 2 individuals are buried together, but not necessarily with intimacy. One may be carefully laid out, the other crumpled, almost discarded, placed at the feet or chest. Sometimes, the second body is missing limbs or a skull. The arrangement suggests hierarchy. One person is the subject. The other, perhaps, was not meant to be there at all. One case from Central Europe reveals a grave where an adult female was buried with a younger individual, possibly a child, curled beneath her, with no grave goods, no care. The woman was laid on her back, the child face down. Was this mother and child? Sacrifice and victim? Mistress and servant? The archaeological record cannot say. But the positioning feels deliberate. Stones weighing down limbs, twisted joints, and broken spines all suggest one thing: the living did not trust the dead to stay still. In some Andean cultures, mummies were bound tightly in fetal bundles and placed upright in tombs, often with faces covered. In others, ropes held the arms and legs in place. The fear of the dead rising, returning, transcends time and geography. In early Europe, too, some Iron Age individuals were buried with nails through their ankles or knees. Not to cause pain, but to anchor the soul. Were these prehistoric practices driven by similar ideas? Perhaps. The concept of the restless dead appears in later mythology worldwide. Revenants, ghosts, witches, spirits who die wrongly or too violently and return to torment the living. And often, those feared most in life, outsiders, accused women, the mentally ill, were treated harshest in death. These burial anomalies may not prove the existence of early accusations, but they suggest the existence of early fear. Fear that something, or someone, had disrupted the balance of life. Fear that death alone was not enough to silence them. Across cultures, these burial patterns echo each other. From the mummies of coastal Peru, whose mouths were sewn shut, to the bog bodies of Iron Age Scandinavia, stabbed, strangled, and buried in marshes, there is a shared impulse to control the dead, to neutralize them. to deny them power. In the prehistoric world, before theologies and scriptures, death was not clean. It was unpredictable. Illness came without warning. Infants died in their sleep. Cattle fell ill. Fires destroyed homes. And when those things happened, people looked for a cause. If someone had been strange, if they had no family, if they spoke oddly, if they had survived a plague when others died, then that cause could take a human form. And when they died, the burial reflected not grief, but fear. Not reverence, but restraint. The problem, of course, is that archaeology does not preserve intention. We cannot ask the dead what they meant. We can only measure, compare, and hypothesize. A stone on a chest may be symbolic, or it may be superstition. A missing skull might indicate veneration or desecration. The line between ritual and punishment is thin. But when patterns emerge, across continents, across millennia, those patterns speak. And what they suggest is that long before organized religion, long before any written record accused a woman of witchcraft, people were already acting on the same fear. The fear of the other. The fear of the unknown. The fear that death was not the end. To understand prehistoric violence, we must also understand reproduction, not as a private matter, but as a force that shapes survival, conflict, and control. For early human societies, reproduction was not merely biological. It was strategic. In small populations, each birth, each death, each union carried consequences that rippled through generations. It wasn't only about who lived. It was about who passed on their blood, and who did not. Genetic studies of ancient human remains have revealed unsettling patterns. In many early farming communities, researchers have found strong genetic bottlenecks on the paternal side. In other words, while female ancestry is relatively diverse, indicating that many women contributed to the gene pool, male ancestry often traces back to only a few dominant lines. This suggests that a small number of men fathered a disproportionate number of children, while others left no legacy at all. This pattern of reproductive skew points to a social structure where only select males, chiefs, warriors, or those in control, were allowed or able to reproduce freely. It also implies that the selection was not mutual. Women were chosen, or taken. The archaeological record echoes this imbalance. At several mass burial sites from the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, skeletons of women and children appear in disproportionately high numbers. Men are fewer, or entirely absent. These graves are not the result of natural disaster or disease. They show signs of trauma. Crushed skulls, broken ribs, blade wounds to the back and pelvis. The positioning of the bodies, intertwined, overlapping, hastily buried, suggests these were victims of organized violence, not random death. In many of these cases, there are no male victims among the dead. The men were not killed, which raises a disturbing possibility: they were the perpetrators. Raids between groups were common in the early agricultural period. Resources were limited. Cropland, animals, water, all had to be defended. But the rewards of violence were not always material. They were reproductive. By killing rival males and capturing women and children, attackers could expand their lineage. Women were not just trophies. They were a biological asset. Their ability to bear children gave them value that could be exploited. There is archaeological evidence of this practice in both skeletal trauma and in burial context. Some women found in early cemeteries appear not to belong genetically or culturally to the community where they were buried. Their bone chemistry, traced through isotopic analysis, shows that they grew up in different regions. Their diets were different. Their ancestral markers foreign. And yet they were buried among the group, often without honor. Their graves lack personal items. No tools, no beads, no offerings. Some are placed in marginal positions, at the edges of cemeteries or outside settlement boundaries. In a few cases, their bodies are bound or buried in submissive postures. It is as if they were tolerated in life, but unwelcome in death. These women were likely absorbed through capture, coerced into sexual relationships, and used for reproduction. Their outsider status remained. They were vessels, not members. In certain cases, trauma on pelvic bones has been cautiously interpreted as signs of repeated childbirth under strain, or physical violence associated with sexual coercion. While it is difficult to draw precise conclusions from bones alone, the combination of stress markers, repeated pregnancies, and burial neglect speaks volumes. But violence wasn't only inflicted during life. It shaped how some were born, and whether they were allowed to live at all. Infanticide, particularly of females, may have been used as a primitive form of population control. In several prehistoric burial sites, the remains of infants are overrepresented. Some cemeteries contain far more infant graves than expected by natural mortality rates. In a few sites, male infants appear to be buried with care, wrapped, ornamented, and positioned gently, while female infants are buried without ceremony or excluded from main burial areas entirely. In a world where survival was fragile, female children, unable to contribute to hunting, warfare, or heavy labor, may have been seen as liabilities. Especially in times of famine, migration, or war, their chances of survival narrowed further, not because of nature, but because of decisions made by the group. These decisions were not spoken. They were not written. But they left traces, burial after burial, bone after bone. Even in adulthood, gender determined status in life and in death. In early farming communities, male graves are often found with tools, weapons, or symbols of labor and leadership. Stone axes, blades, pendants carved from bone or ivory. Their bodies are laid with care, in extended positions, sometimes within communal tombs or central burial spaces. By contrast, many female graves are modest. Some contain beads or domestic tools, spindles, grinding stones. But many contain nothing at all. Their bodies are curled, sometimes face down, or placed at awkward angles. A few show signs of malnourishment or stress fractures, indicating long-term physical strain. Where male burials express honor, female burials often express omission. Of course, there are exceptions. In some areas, women are buried with great wealth, cloaked in ornaments, surrounded by tokens of power. But these are rare. And in many cases, those women may not have been revered for themselves, but feared. There is a long-standing pattern across prehistory and early history of powerful or unusual women being set apart. Not elevated, separated. When a woman was wealthy, childless, unmarried, or simply unusual, she often received a burial that diverged from community norms. She may have been placed far from others, given no grave goods, or too many. Her body twisted, marked, or altered in ways that suggest suspicion, not celebration. The interpretation is not simple. Some of these women may have been shamans, midwives, spiritual figures. Others may have been blamed for disease, misfortune, or loss. Their difference became dangerous. In this context, the idea of the witch is not yet formed, but its outline begins to take shape. The woman who could not be controlled. The woman who bore no sons. The woman whose children died. The woman who spoke to herself, or helped others, or survived when others did not. She may not have been accused, but she was marked. In life, through exclusion, and in death, through burial. This pattern of reproductive control, gendered violence, and ritual separation emerges not from isolated cultures, but across the prehistoric world. From Europe to the Near East, from Siberia to the Andes, the same logic repeats. Women were valued when fertile, discarded when not, and feared when they could not be explained. Their bones speak without words. Their graves whisper truths that written history would later echo with greater cruelty. Long before the word, which was invented, some women had already borne its weight. There is no writing from the Paleolithic. No prayers, no confessions, no myths in words. Yet somehow, the inner world of prehistoric humans survives, in silence, in pigment, in the positions of bones. And it begins with the walls. In caves across Europe, Africa, and Asia, humans painted. They painted in ochre, ash, and charcoal. They used fingers, animal hair, hollow reeds. The surfaces they chose were not random. They were the deepest parts, chambers where daylight could never reach, where breath echoed and flame flickered. These were not practical spaces. They were spiritual. And the images they left behind are not passive. They challenge. They speak of minds shaped by awe, fear, and possibly altered states of consciousness. At Chauvet Cave in southern France, dating to around 30,000 BC, the walls are filled with animals: bison, lions, horses, rhinoceros. But there are also hybrids. A figure with a man's legs and a bull's head. A body with antlers and human arms. These are not depictions of food. They are visions, symbols, beings that likely lived in the mind. Other caves display handprints, dozens, sometimes hundreds. Some are made by placing a hand on stone and blowing pigment across it, leaving behind a negative silhouette. Others are dipped in ochre and stamped directly. They are often clustered together, layered, overlapping, as if marking presence or passage. Spirals, dots, crosshatches, and grid patterns also appear. These may have served as maps, calendars, or something less decipherable, expressions of altered thought. Psychologists and neurologists studying the overlap between trance states and visual perception note that such patterns often accompany hallucinations, whether from sensory deprivation, deep meditation, or psychoactive plants. The choice to go deep into the earth, to mark stone in the dark, suggests that prehistoric people were seeking something more than safety. They were seeking meaning. But what did they believe? In the absence of writing, we turn to burial. And here, too, the evidence suggests belief, not only in an afterlife, but in unseen forces shaping life and death. The use of red ochre in burials is widespread. It appears in graves from Europe to the Levant to Australia, often sprinkled over the skull, chest, or pelvic area. Ochre stains are also found on tools, beads, and carved bones. Its meaning is not fixed. It may have represented blood, rebirth, transformation. But its presence, deliberate, repeated, points to ritual. Many individuals were buried with items that appear symbolic: animal teeth, seashells from distant coasts, pierced beads, tools too worn to be useful. Some of these may have been personal possessions. Others, especially those not native to the burial region, suggest trade, gifting, or ritual function. Among child burials, patterns emerge that are even more revealing. In some cemeteries, children are buried alone, not near adults, not in family clusters, often in shallow pits. Some have small objects: a toy figurine, a bead necklace, a flint blade too small to use. Others have nothing at all. The contrast is striking. Why were some children buried with tenderness, and others discarded? It may reflect status, or cause of death, or perception. If a child died during an outbreak, or after exhibiting strange behaviors, the community may have viewed them not as victims, but as vessels of something dangerous. The same applies to solitary adult burials, especially those far from settlements. In caves, ravines, or isolated pits, skeletons have been found without company, without goods, sometimes partially burned or dismembered. These may have been outcasts, banished, feared, or ritually cleansed. The isolation was not only physical, it was spiritual. Burial apart from the group may have symbolized more than punishment. It may have been protection, from the dead, or for the living. What would lead a community to exile someone in death? Perhaps they were seen as cursed, or as spiritually contagious. Perhaps they survived something others did not, an illness, a storm, a famine, and that survival made them suspect. Or perhaps they were simply different. In small, tightly woven groups, deviation could provoke unease. A woman who bore no children, a man who spoke to himself, a child born with a deformity. In a world without medicine, without explanation, such differences could feel supernatural. Modern neuroscience offers another layer. The stress of nomadic life, constant movement, hunger, danger, triggers physiological responses we still carry. Elevated cortisol, hypervigilance, paranoia. In high-stress environments, humans seek patterns, even where none exist. We look for reasons, for someone to blame. And when survival becomes a collective effort, those who cannot contribute, or who disrupt stability, become liabilities. Whether intentionally or not, communities may push them out, even in death. This raises a deeper question. Did prehistoric people believe in evil? Not as a concept of morality, but as a force, a presence that disrupted balance. Something that lived in individuals, or passed through them. Something that could be sensed, feared, and buried. The physical evidence does not say yes, but it does not say no. What it shows is action, burial that deviates, repetition that signals intention. Some people were not buried to be remembered. They were buried to be erased, or contained. That difference marks a turning point in human thought. The shift from mourning to management, from grief to suspicion. They did not need words to accuse. The grave was enough. In the darkness of a cave, in the red dust on bone, in the absence of offerings, we find their verdict. And it is one we recognize, not because we understand it, but because we have seen it repeated. Inquisition, isolation, witch trials, ostracism. Long before those terms existed, the impulse was already there. To name the other, to fear them, and to bury them apart. The world changed, but the fear did not. By the Bronze Age, new tools, weapons, and social hierarchies had reshaped how people lived and how they died. But beneath the surface, older instincts endured. Burial practices that once served small tribal communities became codified, ritualized, and enforced. The fear of the different, the cursed, the spiritually dangerous, what had once been instinct, was now tradition. In Central Europe, archaeologists have uncovered what are now referred to as witch pits. These are shallow, hurried burials often dating to the late Bronze Age, usually containing a single body, typically a woman, interred with signs of trauma or restraint. Many are face down, some with stones placed over the pelvis or neck. Tools are absent. Objects of value are rare. The location of these graves, outside formal cemeteries, along borders or thresholds, mirrors prehistoric patterns of exclusion. The dead were not honored. They were hidden. And while the language of witch did not yet exist, the treatment of these individuals suggests a cultural memory. Certain people needed to be buried differently. Not to protect them, but to protect everyone else. As written history emerged, this memory took form. The scapegoating of women, particularly those who were unmarried, childless, elderly, or physically marked, became a persistent thread through ancient and medieval society. In Mesopotamian law codes, women accused of sorcery could be drowned. In the Greco-Roman world, women who violated ritual norms were cast out or imprisoned. Some were accused not of crimes, but of bringing misfortune, failed harvests, infertility, disease. Their punishment was not always death. Sometimes it was exile. Sometimes silence. But the logic remained. When the world became unstable, someone had to be blamed. In early Christian Europe, that blame was formalized. The same burial anxieties of the prehistoric world, stones, isolation, face-down positioning, reappeared in Christian-era cemeteries. But now, they were accompanied by doctrine. The belief in spirits that could rise from the grave, vampires, revenants, witches, led to new methods of containment. Some were buried with stakes driven through the chest. Others had bricks forced into their mouths. In Poland, several medieval graves reveal women buried with scythes laid across their throats or legs, tools intended to decapitate or disable if the dead attempted to rise. These acts were not symbolic. They were protective. In parallel, the figure of the dangerous woman began to take on mythological form. Lilith, in Jewish folklore, became the archetype of the female demon, child-snatching, wild-haired, sexually untamed. Hecate, the Greek goddess of boundaries and magic, was invoked both in protection and fear. The banshee of Celtic tradition wailed as an omen of death, always female, always spectral, always on the outside. These figures were not witches in the modern sense. They were echoes, representations of a fear far older than writing. Women who moved alone. Women who spoke to spirits. Women who bore no children or too many. Women who knew the wrong herbs, or none at all. What began as burial became belief, and belief became law. By the early modern period, accusations of witchcraft became part of legal systems. In Europe, tens of thousands were executed, mostly women, often older, usually marginalized. Trials were held. Torture applied. Confessions extracted. But the patterns remained the same: isolation, accusation, destruction. The village outcast became the condemned. And in her treatment, be it trial, stake, or burial, we see the continuation of prehistoric fears, now given names and structures. This is not coincidence. It is continuity. The same instincts that led Neolithic people to bury certain women face down with stones upon their bodies survived into the age of books and judges. The same suspicions that led small bands to exclude, isolate, or erase the difference echoed in courts and pulpits. Not because people had not progressed, but because fear, once embedded, takes generations to unlearn. Modern anthropology traces this continuity not only in ritual, but in social structure. Across centuries, societies consistently created categories of spiritual danger and populated them with the marginalized. The barren, the old, the mad, the unlucky. They were not accused because of what they had done. They were accused because of what others feared they might bring. Prehistory planted the idea. History wrote it down. And today, when we find those ancient bones, bound, burned, buried in silence, we are not just uncovering individuals. We are uncovering the foundations of a cultural pattern that would span millennia. A pattern that began without language, but not without judgment. A pattern that tells us more about the living than the dead. Beneath the earth, the body still lies. Face down. Arms folded awkwardly beneath the torso. A stone pressed against the back. No tools, no beads, no offerings. No sign that anyone returned. We do not know her name. We do not know how she lived. But her bones speak the language of exclusion. She was not buried with honor. She was buried with caution. Archaeologists catalog the details, the soil type, the position of the limbs, the signs of healed or unhealed trauma. But science can only go so far. What remains is not a story, but a question. What had she done? Or more disturbingly, what had others believed she was? In returning to this grave, the first one we encountered, we are not uncovering a mystery that needs solving. We are acknowledging a wound that repeats. Because this woman, or someone like her, appears across the prehistoric world. In pits, in caves, under stones. Their bodies tell a pattern, not an accident. A recurring equation, difference equals danger. And that danger had to be buried. The truth is, we don't know their crimes, if there were any. We don't know their beliefs, or their last words, or whether they went willingly or with protest. We only know how they were treated when it was over. and that treatment reveals more about the living than the dead. The prehistoric world was harsh. Life was short, hunger common, security rare. In such conditions, fear became its own kind of intelligence. It shaped behavior, enforced cohesion, punished dissent. It looked for threats, inside and out. And when no explanation could be found for misfortune, it created one. Sometimes, that explanation took the form of a person, not because of what they did, but because of what others believed they could do. She may have spoken strangely. She may have survived when others did not. She may have lost children, or never had them. She may have dreamed aloud, or touched the wrong object, or simply been alone when misfortune struck. That was enough. The people who buried her did not do so in hatred. They did so in fear. That is the most chilling part. Because these are not the records of tyrants. These are not royal decrees or doctrinal trials. These are the quiet, unspoken judgments of ordinary people, people just like us, making decisions based on survival, suspicion, and silence. And those decisions left behind bones. The face-down dead. The headless women. The isolated child. The elder without grave goods. The outsider pinned with stones. These are not just archaeological data points. These were people. Real, breathing, suffering people. Mothers. Daughters. Strangers. Neighbors. They lived. And then they were buried differently. Not remembered. Not named. Just erased. And yet, even in that erasure, they remain. Their bones bear witness to something older than myth. Older than the written word. A truth that lives deep in our species. The fear of the other. The fear of what we cannot see. The fear that misfortune must have a source, and that someone must carry the blame. This fear is not unique to one place or people. It spans continents and centuries. It wears different clothes, speaks different languages, and adopts different rituals. But its roots are always the same, and its victims are often the same too. Women who lived at the margins. The sick. The childless. The mentally ill. The wanderer. The strange. The people who were not protected. The people who were left behind. When we study these graves, we are not simply looking at the past. We are looking at the origin of exclusion, at the deep history of how humans define themselves, by who they accept and who they cast out. And so, we are not with her, but with us. In every society, in every era, someone is buried face down. Who is it today?
What you just watched wasn't just history. It was a voice that refused to be forgotten. And there are so many more waiting to be heard. So if you felt something today, if the past reached out and touched you, then don't let it fade. Subscribe to Unique History Alive. And walk with us, one buried truth at a time. Because history isn't dead. It's just been waiting for someone, like you,